The sun was sinking low over the Great Plains, draping the horizon in streaks of orange and crimson that seemed to stretch into eternity. Dust clung to the air, stirred by a restless wind that rattled dry stalks of grass and whispered through the weathered fences of Ethan Cole's ranch. The land was vast, beautiful, and unforgiving, much like the life he had lived upon it. For years, Ethan's days had followed the same rhythm: rise before dawn, work the cattle, mend the fences, eat alone, and sleep beneath the silence of the prairie night. The monotony was steady, dependable, but beneath it lay an ache, a quiet loneliness that gnawed at him when the evening fire burned too low. Ethan was not a man strangers remembered easily. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the stoic air of someone who had endured loss and built walls too high for most to scale. His late wife had died 5 winters ago, leaving him with memories that stung sharper than a knife when the cold winds howled through the empty house. Since then, he had lived for the ranch alone, convincing himself that survival was purpose enough. Yet in the stillness of the night, when coyotes called in the distance, he sometimes found himself staring at the shadows, wondering if his life was meant to end in silence. Miles away, in the dusty edge of a town worn thin by hardship, another story was unraveling. Lila Grace, scarcely in her 20s, stood with her head bowed, her hands protectively resting against the swell of her belly. She was young, exhausted, and visibly pregnant, her fragile figure carrying not only the weight of new life, but the burden of betrayal. Her own mother, driven by desperation and shame, had decided that her daughter was worth more as a transaction than as kin. In a society where a young woman pregnant without a husband was branded as ruined, Lila's mother saw the child as nothing but a stain, and the girl herself as a liability. The choice was made in whispers behind closed doors, but to Lila, the betrayal thundered louder than any storm. She had begged for compassion, for patience, for a chance to make her own way, but her pleas fell on ears deafened by bitterness. Her mother told her bluntly that she would be sold to a man willing to take her, before the whole town turns its back on us. Lila's heart fractured, not merely from the cruelty of being treated as an object, but from the crushing knowledge that the one person who should have protected her had chosen to abandon her instead. Ethan crossed paths with this grim transaction by chance, or perhaps by fate. He had ridden into town for supplies, the same as he had done countless times before, planning only to restock flour, tobacco, and nails for the fences. Yet when he stepped through the swinging doors of the saloon, he found himself drawn to the backroom whispers, where voices bartered over something more sinister than cattle or land. The words he caught, young, strong, still carrying, made his jaw tighten. When he pushed the door wider, his gaze landed on Lila, pale, trembling, her eyes fixed on the floor as her mother's voice pitched like a merchant at market. Ethan froze, disgust knotting his chest. He knew the roughness of life out here, knew how desperation could drive people to cruel decisions, but this was something deeper, something uglier. The woman wasn't negotiating for her daughter's safety. She was selling her like a mule unfit for pasture. The men gathered eyed Lila with a mix of hunger and scorn, their leers cutting deeper than any blade. Ethan could have turned away. He told himself this wasn't his fight, that a solitary rancher had no business stepping into the chaos of another family's ruin. Yet the sight of Lila's trembling hands resting on her stomach, shielding the unborn child as though her body was the last fortress she had left, burned into him. For Lila, the moment Ethan entered the room was one she would remember forever. She didn't lift her eyes at first, assuming he was just another man come to weigh her worth. But there was something different in the silence that followed, in the way his boots stopped short of stepping closer, in the way his shadow fell not over her, but between her and the others. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no greed, no hunger, only steel. "This ain't right," Ethan said flatly. The room quieted, her mother bristling at his intrusion. "It's none of your concern," the older woman snapped, though her voice trembled with the desperation of someone who knew her cruelty was being laid bare. But Ethan didn't move. He was not a man given to rash words, and yet something in his gut refused to let him walk away. He saw in Lila not just a girl betrayed, but a soul standing on the edge of ruin, And perhaps, if he admitted the truth to himself, he also saw the faintest flicker of what his own life had been missing: connection, purpose, and a chance to guard something precious again. By nightfall, Ethan rode back toward his ranch, supplies packed in his wagon, and seated beside him, shrouded in silence, was Lila Grace. She had agreed reluctantly, mistrust sharp in her every glance. She didn't thank him, didn't look at him, didn't believe his intentions were as simple as rescue. Why would she? Every man in her world had been willing to use her for gain, and her own mother had sold her without remorse. To her, Ethan was just another captor, even if his voice had been steady and his hands respectful. For Ethan, the decision weighed heavy. He hadn't planned for this, hadn't imagined returning to his quiet ranch with a pregnant stranger who carried more pain than she could bear. Yet as the prairie opened wide before them, stars beginning to flicker in the sky, he felt the stirrings of something long dormant. The silence between them was thick, filled with questions neither dared to ask, but beneath it all lay the spark of a truth neither could deny. Their lives had shifted. Lila clutched her belly tighter as the wagon jolted over uneven ground, whispering to the child within as though to promise safety. Ethan glanced at her from the corner of his eye, reading the determination beneath her fear. He didn't know yet how to bridge the gulf between them, but he knew one thing for certain: he would not let her be broken again. By the time the ranch came into view, its wooden frame stark against the horizon, Lila's eyes widened with both dread and fragile hope. For Ethan, the sight of his empty homestead no longer looked like solitude. It looked like the beginning of something uncharted, something dangerous, and perhaps something sacred. And so, with the prairie winds howling around them and uncertainty looming large, two lives scarred by loss and betrayal stepped onto the path that would bind them together. Neither knew if trust was possible, or if healing could truly come, but fate had already set their course. The wheels of the wagon creaked as they rolled across the uneven prairie, each jolt a reminder to Lila that her life had been reduced to a bargain struck behind closed doors. Though the cool night air brushed her face, it did little to ease the fire of humiliation burning in her chest. She sat rigid, hands wrapped protectively around her stomach, casting quick glances at the man beside her. Ethan's profile was set in stone, his jaw tight, eyes fixed on the horizon as if the weight of stars themselves demanded his attention. He had paid for her freedom, or so he claimed, but in Lila's mind, a transaction was a transaction. She had been bought, and that knowledge curled around her heart like a snake. The memory of the saloon's backroom haunted her. Her mother's voice, sharp and unrelenting, still rang in her ears. "You'll ruin us all, girl," she had spat, her words dripping with contempt. "You think I'll feed another mouth, when no man will have you? Be grateful someone's willing to take you at all." Ethan hadn't haggled, hadn't even looked at her the way the other men did. He'd placed money on the table, with a quiet firmness that silenced the room. But to Lila, it didn't matter that his eyes held no hunger. His act sealed her fate all the same. She belonged to him now, at least in the eyes of everyone who had witnessed it. At the ranch, silence was their constant companion. Ethan led her to a small room off the main hall, its window looking out onto the endless plains. "You'll have privacy here," he said, his voice low, deliberate. "Take the bed. There's water in the basin. If you need anything, the kitchen's down the hall." He lingered a moment, as though searching for words to bridge the canyon between them, but none came. With a nod, he left her alone. Lila sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wooden walls that smelled faintly of pine and dust. The room was clean, simple, and safe, yet she felt no comfort. To her, it was another cage, just with softer bars. She whispered to the child inside her, promising that one day they would be free, even if she didn't yet know how. Days slipped into a pattern marked by unease. Ethan worked from dawn until dusk, tending to cattle, fixing fences, mending roofs, his presence around the ranch steady but distant. Lila kept mostly to the house, preparing simple meals and moving carefully with her growing belly. They spoke little, their conversations limited to necessity. "There's bread in the cupboard," or "the water pail's by the door." The air between them was thick with unspoken fears. In town, whispers spread quickly. News of Ethan's purchase traveled faster than wildfire on dry grass. Men jeered quietly behind his back, accusing him of desperation. Women eyed Lila with pity or disdain when she ventured into the general store, her cheeks burning under their scrutiny. "That's the girl her own mother sold," someone muttered, not softly enough. Ethan's jaw would tighten whenever he heard such remarks, but he never lashed out. He would simply place his goods on the counter, pay, and guide Lila back to the wagon with a quiet dignity that only deepened the town's gossip. Lila's mistrust festered. She couldn't reconcile Ethan's restraint with her experiences of men. If he wasn't cruel, then he must be waiting. Waiting until she was more desperate, until she had no choice but to yield. At night, she lay awake, the creak of the house settling making her heart race, convinced he would come through the door. But he never did. Instead, she would sometimes hear his boots pacing in the main room, or the scrape of a chair by the dying fire. He, too, was awake, haunted by his own thoughts. Their unspoken conflict reached its first breaking point on a day when the sky threatened rain. Ethan returned from the fields to find Lila struggling with a heavy bucket at the well. "Leave it," he said firmly, stepping forward to take it from her. She recoiled, clutching the handle tighter. "I can do it myself," she snapped, her voice edged with both fear and defiance. "You shouldn't be lifting that in your condition," Ethan replied, his tone calm but unyielding. "It's not safe for the baby." Her eyes flashed. "The baby is mine, not yours." The word struck him harder than she realized. Ethan froze, then stepped back slowly, allowing her to wrestle with the bucket even as water sloshed over her skirts. He said nothing more, but the quiet hurt in his eyes lingered long after he walked away. That night, Lila replayed the scene over and over. She told herself she had spoken the truth. Her child was hers alone, the one thing no one could steal or sell. Yet a small, guilty voice whispered that Ethan's concern hadn't been ownership but protection. She silenced the thought quickly, unwilling to lower her guard. Trust had betrayed her once already. For Ethan, the sting of her words cut deep. He hadn't rescued her out of pity or possession, but because he couldn't stand by while cruelty reigned. Still, he realized, she had no reason to believe him. Trust wasn't something he could demand. It was something he would have to earn, if it could be earned at all. The days grew colder as autumn edged closer, bringing with it harsher winds and longer nights. Lila's pregnancy advanced, her steps slower, her breaths heavier. Ethan kept his distance, offering help only in small ways. A chair pulled closer to the fire, wood chopped and stacked higher by the door, a basket of apples left quietly on the kitchen table. She noticed these gestures, even as she told herself they meant nothing. Then came the night of the storm. The wind howled through the cracks in the cabin, rain lashing against the windows with relentless fury. Lila tried to rise from her chair, but exhaustion overwhelmed her. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, clutching her belly with a cry of pain. Panic surged through her, not for herself, but for the child within. Ethan was there in an instant, his arm steady as he lifted her from the ground. For a moment, their eyes locked, hers wide with fear, his burning with determination. "I've got you," he said firmly, carrying her to her room. His words, simple yet resolute, cut through the storm's roar. And for the first time since the night of her betrayal, Lila felt a flicker of something she thought long dead, the fragile, dangerous spark of trust. The storm that had shaken the ranch left more than broken branches and soggy earth in its wake. For Lila, it left a lingering memory of strong arms lifting her, of a voice steady and sure cutting through her panic. She lay in bed the next morning, staring at the wooden beams overhead, wondering why his words, "I've got you," still echoed so clearly. She had spent weeks convincing herself that Ethan Cole was no different from any man who saw her as property. Yet the storm had shown her something else, restraint, care, and an unshakable steadiness. Still, mistrust does not vanish overnight. When she rose and moved slowly into the kitchen, she found a bowl of broth waiting on the table. The fire had been stoked high, warming the room against the chill. Ethan sat near the hearth, mending a piece of tack, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He didn't announce the gesture, didn't insist she eat. He simply nodded once, as though the meal were a natural thing, and returned to his work. Lila's pride prickled, but her hunger won. As she ate, she caught him glancing at her only once, his eyes holding neither ownership nor pity, only quiet concern. In the days that followed, subtle changes began to unfold. Ethan continued his endless chores, yet now he found himself leaving small offerings for her. A shawl draped over the back of a chair when the nights turned cold, fresh wood stacked neatly by her door, a basket of eggs from the hens left on the kitchen counter. Lila noticed, though she rarely spoke of it. Instead, she began to contribute in her own way. She mended a torn shirt she found on the line, kneaded bread with trembling but determined hands, and swept the cabin floor until it gleamed. For Ethan, the difference was startling. The ranch, once echoing with emptiness, now carried the soft hum of life. The smell of fresh bread, the sight of curtains pulled open to let in morning light, the sound of quiet humming as Lila worked. These were details he had thought lost forever. The house was no longer just walls and roof. It was slowly becoming a home. One afternoon, he returned from the fields to find Lila outside, her swollen belly leading the way as she knelt in the dirt to scatter feed for the chickens. Her laugh rang out, soft, hesitant, but genuine, as the hens fluttered and clucked around her. Ethan froze, struck by the sound. He hadn't realized how long it had been since laughter, any laughter, had graced his land. "You'll scare them if you stand there like a post," Lila said, catching his stare. There was no venom in her tone, only a hint of teasing. Ethan's lips twitched into something that almost resembled a smile. Later that week, when Lila ventured into town again, the whispers resumed. The townsfolk still gossiped, still cast sidelong glances. But this time Ethan did not simply endure. When the storekeeper made a crude remark about buying himself a family, Ethan's voice cut sharp and cold. "She's here as my guest," he said firmly. "You'll treat her with the respect she's due." The shop fell silent, eyes wide at the steel in his tone. Lila, standing beside him, felt a warmth stir in her chest. For once, she wasn't shamed into silence. Someone had spoken for her, not over her. At the ranch, evenings grew softer. Ethan sometimes told stories of his youth, brief glimpses of growing up on the frontier, of learning to rope cattle, of the mistakes and triumphs that had shaped him. Lila, in turn, began to reveal fragments of her own past. The laughter she once shared with childhood friends, the ache of losing her father young, and the sharp sting of betrayal when her mother traded her dignity for coin. These exchanges were tentative, like two wary travelers meeting at a crossroads, yet each word chipped away at the wall between them. Still, fear lingered in quiet corners. One night, as she stitched a blanket for the baby, Lila admitted in a whisper, "I don't know how to trust anymore." Ethan didn't answer right away. He simply set aside his tools and looked at her with a gaze steady as the mountains. "Then don't," he said softly. "Not yet. Let trust grow on its own time. You owe me nothing but honesty." Those words lingered long after the lamp was extinguished. For Lila, they were both terrifying and liberating. No demands, no conditions, only space. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, she and her child could find safety here. The transformation extended beyond their hearts. Together, they worked to prepare for the child's arrival. Ethan built a sturdy crib from pine, sanding it smooth until the wood gleamed. Lila sewed tiny clothes, her fingers trembling over each stitch as she whispered blessings into the fabric. The cabin filled with signs of anticipation, blankets folded neatly, herbs hung to dry, a cradle rocking gently in the corner. For Ethan, who had resigned himself to silence and emptiness, the preparations felt like a miracle unfolding before his eyes. As winter edged closer, the ranch braced for hardship, yet inside the cabin, warmth grew. Ethan found himself listening for Lila's footsteps, drawn to her presence more than he dared admit. Lila, in turn, began to see in him not a captor but a protector, flawed, guarded, but deeply human. The lines between stranger and companion blurred, replaced by something fragile but undeniable. Then, one bitter night, as the wind howled and snowflakes battered the windows, Lila's cries pierced the stillness. Pain radiated through her body, sharp and relentless. The child was coming. Panic surged through her as fear clawed at her chest. What if she wasn't strong enough? What if the baby didn't survive? Ethan rushed to her side, his face pale but resolute. He had faced stampeding cattle, raging storms, and lonely winters, but nothing had prepared him for this. Still, he took her hand, steadying her with the same words he had spoken on the night of the storm. "I've got you, Lila. You're not alone." Her grip tightened around his, her eyes wide with both terror and trust. In that moment, as the cabin filled with the raw cries of labor, the walls of fear crumbled. The journey they had stumbled into, born of betrayal, bound by survival, was about to deliver its greatest test, and perhaps its greatest gift. The cabin shook with every gust of winter wind, as though the very earth trembled in sympathy with Lila's cries. Her face was pale, slick with sweat, her hair clinging to her temples as she clutched Ethan's hand with a strength that surprised them both. The storm outside roared, yet it was her voice, raw, anguished, determined, that filled the small room with a sound both terrifying and holy. Ethan's heart thundered. He had spent years braving the fiercest storms, but this was different. This was life itself demanding passage, fragile and fierce all at once. He boiled water, fetched cloths, did everything he could remember from watching his mother bring life into the world years ago. But mostly, he stayed by Lila's side, his hand anchored in hers, repeating in a low, steady voice, "You're not alone. You're strong enough. I'm right here." Hours bled together. Time became a blur of pain and whispered encouragements, of snow piling high against the cabin walls, of shadows flickering across the wooden beams as the lanterns burned low. Lila screamed, cursed, wept, but she never let go of Ethan's hand. Her grip was a lifeline, tethering them both through the storm. And then, just as dawn broke and the first pale light seeped through the frost-glazed window, a new cry pierced the air, not Lila's, but higher, sharper, fragile and fierce. A child's cry. Ethan froze, his breath caught in his chest. Lila collapsed against the pillows, tears streaming down her face, as he wrapped the tiny, squirming infant in a clean cloth. "A girl," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with wonder. He had expected exhaustion, maybe even disappointment from Lila, given her past. But when he placed the baby in her trembling arms, she didn't recoil. She drew the infant close, her tears falling freely onto the child's face. "A girl," Lila echoed, her voice breaking. For a heartbeat, fear flashed in her eyes, memories of punishment, rejection, and blame. But as she looked into Ethan's gaze, she saw no anger, no regret, only awe. "She's perfect," Ethan said firmly, his calloused hand brushing the child's downy hair. "She's a blessing, Lila. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Lila clutched the baby tighter, her sobs turning from despair to relief. In that moment, something shifted deep within her. For the first time in years, she felt her daughter was not a curse but a gift. She was not a failure as a woman, nor a burden. She was a mother entrusted with a miracle. The storm outside began to quiet, the howling wind softening into silence. Inside the cabin, the new family sat in a fragile peace, bound together not by contract or transaction, but by blood, by choice, by love. Over the following days, exhaustion mingled with joy. Ethan moved through chores with renewed purpose, his steps lighter, his heart fuller. When neighbors came to check on them after the storm, their eyes widened at the sight of the infant cradled in Lila's arms. Whispers rippled through the community, but this time Ethan stood tall, his voice unyielding. "This is my family," he declared simply. "She belongs here, and so does her child." No one dared challenge him. Respect for Ethan ran deep, and his tone left no room for mockery. Slowly, the whispers turned into quiet admiration. The lonely rancher who once kept to himself now had a family that breathed life into his homestead. Lila's healing was not instant, but it was steady. Nights were still haunted by shadows of the past, but when she woke in terror, Ethan was always there, steady and unmovable, a constant presence that spoke of safety. He never demanded her gratitude, never pressed her for affection. Instead, he offered patience, the rarest gift of all. With each passing day, She found her voice growing stronger, her confidence budding like spring after a harsh winter. One evening, as she rocked her daughter by the fire, Lila looked across the room at Ethan. He was carving a toy horse from a block of wood, his brow furrowed in concentration. For the first time, she didn't see a stranger who had bought her freedom. She saw the man who had given her back her dignity. "You've given me more than shelter," she whispered. Ethan looked up, startled. She met his gaze with steady eyes. "You've given me a chance to believe again." He set down the carving knife, his expression softening. "You gave me the same," he said quietly. "I thought I was destined to live and die alone. But now," his eyes drifted to the baby, sleeping peacefully in Lila's arms. "Now I see what I was waiting for all along." Their bond grew not from grand declarations, but from countless small moments, shared chores, gentle laughter, the rhythm of life built together. And though love was never spoken in loud words, it bloomed quietly, a steadfast flame that neither storm nor gossip could extinguish. Seasons changed. The ranch that once echoed with silence now rang with the cries of a child, the melody of lullabies, and the laughter of two people learning to live not in fear, but in trust. Lila's daughter grew strong, her tiny fingers curling around Ethan's as though claiming him as her own. In time, neighbors stopped whispering about scandal and instead spoke of the miracle that had transformed the Cole ranch. The lonely rancher was lonely no more, and the woman once discarded as worthless had discovered her worth could not be measured by another's cruelty. Together, they had rewritten the story forced upon them, turning shame into strength, despair into hope. In the quiet of one golden evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon in hues of fire and rose, Ethan stood on the porch beside Lila, their daughter nestled between them. The land stretched wide and unbroken before them, promising both hardship and possibility. Ethan slipped his arm around Lila's shoulders, and for the first time, she leaned into him without hesitation. "This," he said softly, his eyes on the endless fields, "was the miracle I'd been waiting for." Lila smiled, her heart swelling with something she had once thought lost forever. "And so was I," she whispered. The wind carried their words across the plains, blending them with the timeless rhythm of the American West, a land where suffering and hope often walked hand in hand, and where, sometimes, love was born not in the absence of hardship, but through its fire.